From the American Experience Storybook, George Washington, 1732 to 1799. Still I hope I shall always possess firmness and virtue enough to maintain what I consider the most enviable of all titles, the character of an honest man. George Washington to Alexander Hamilton on August 28, 1788. Believe it or not, George Washington never wanted a career in politics. He was tall and brave, educated, an officer in 2 wars, French and Indian, and the American Revolutionary, a delegate to the First and Second Continental Congress, and of course, America's first president. But at heart, George was a farmer. As a homeschooler, he learned some of the usual subjects such as math, geography, and Latin. But what he found most useful in life were the skills of farming and surveying. Even after he became a wealthy landowner, George would often work alongside his field hands because he enjoyed it. At the start of the French and Indian War, George was only a messenger, but he quickly became a major in the army, later a colonel, and in the Revolutionary War, a major general. For a long time, George did not want the American colonies to declare independence, but when the Townshend Acts came, he admitted that it was only right for the colonists to resist such unfair treatment. Both times George was elected president, the votes were unanimous. At the end of his second term, George firmly but gracefully declined a third and went home to work his farm until he died at his Mount Vernon home 2 years later. The following excerpt is from the Stories of Great Americans for Little Americans by Edward Higgleston, chapter Washington and His Hatchet. It was Arbor Day in the mossy hills, and Johnny Littlejohn had to speak a piece that had something to do with trees. He thought it would be a good plan to say something about the little cherry tree that Washington spoiled with his hatchet when he was a little boy. This is what he said. He had a hatchet, little George, a hatchet bright and new, and sharp enough to cut a stick, a little stick, in two. He hacked and whacked and whacked and hacked, this sturdy little man. He hacked a log and hacked a fence, as round about he ran. He hacked his father's cherry tree, and made an ugly spot. The bark was soft, the hatchet sharp, and little George forgot. You know the rest. The father frowned and asked the reason why. You know the good old story runs, he could not tell a lie. A boy that chopped that cherry tree soon grew to be a youth. At work and books he hacked away, and still he told the truth. The youth became a famous man, above 6 feet in height, and when he had good work to do, he hacked with all his might. He fought the armies that the king had sent across the sea. He battled up and down the land to set his country free. For 7 long years he hacked and whacked with all his might and main until the British sailed away and did not come again. The following excerpt is from the chapter Washington's Christmas Gift. Washington was fighting to set his country free. But the army that the King of England sent to fight him was stronger than Washington's army. Washington was beaten and driven out of Brooklyn. Then he had to leave New York. After that, he marched away into New Jersey to save his army from being taken. At last, he crossed the Delaware River, where he was safe for a while. Some of the Hessian soldiers that the king had hired to fight against the Americans came to Trenton. Trenton is on the Delaware River. Washington and his men were on the other side of the Delaware from the Hessians. Washington's men were discouraged. They'd been driven back all the way from Brooklyn. It was winter, and they had no warm house to stay in. They had not even warm clothes. They were dressed in old clothes that people had given them. Some of them were barefooted in this cold weather. The Hessians and other soldiers of the king were waiting for the river to freeze over. Then they would march across on the ice. They meant to fight Washington once more and break up his army. But Washington was thinking about something too. He was waiting for Christmas. He knew that the Hessian soldiers on the other side of the river would eat and drink a great deal on Christmas Day. The afternoon of Christmas came. The Hessians were singing and drinking in Trenton. But Washington was marching up the riverbank. Some of his barefoot men left blood marks on the snow as they marched. The men and cannon were put into flatboats. These boats were pushed across the river with poles. There were many great pieces of ice in the river, but all night long the flatboats were pushed across and then back again for more men. It was 3 o'clock in the morning after Christmas when the last Americans crossed the river. It was hailing and snowing, and it was very cold. 2 or 3 of the soldiers were frozen to death. It was 8 o'clock in the morning when Washington got to Trenton. The Hessians were sleeping soundly. The sound of the American drums waked them. They jumped out of their beds. They ran into the streets. They tried to fight the Americans, but it was too late. Washington had already taken their cannon. His men were firing these at the Hessians. The Hessians ran into the fields to get away, but the Americans caught them. The battle was soon over. Washington had taken 900 prisoners. This was called the Battle of Trenton. It gave great joy to all the Americans. It was Washington's Christmas gift to the country. The following excerpt is from the chapter, How Washington Got Out of a Trap. After the Battle of Trenton, Washington went back across the Delaware River. He had not men enough to fight the whole British army. But the Americans were glad when they heard that he had beaten the Hessians. They sent him more soldiers. Then he went back across the river to Trenton again. There was a British general named Cornwallis. He marched to Trenton. He fought against Washington. Cornwallis had more men than Washington. Night came and they could not see to fight. There was a little creek between the two armies. Washington had not boats enough to carry his men across the river. Cornwallis was sure to beat him if they should fight a battle the next morning. Cornwallis said, "I will catch the fox in the morning." He called Washington a fox. He thought he had him in a trap. Cornwallis sent for some more soldiers to come from Princeton in the morning. He wanted them to help him catch the fox. But foxes sometimes get out of traps. When it was dark, Washington had all his campfires lighted. He put men to digging where the British could hear them. He made Cornwallis think that he was throwing up banks of earth and getting ready to fight in the morning. But Washington didn't stay in Trenton. He did not wish to be caught like a fox in a trap. He could not get across the river, but he knew a road that went around the place where Cornwallis and his army was. He took that road and got behind the British army. It was like John waiting to catch James. James is in the house. John is waiting at the front door to catch James when he comes out. But James slips out by the back way. John hears him call, "Hello!" James has gone around behind him and got away. Washington went out of Trenton in the darkness. You might say that he marched out by the back door. He left Cornwallis watching the front door. The Americans went away quietly. They left a few men to keep up the fires and make a noise like digging. Before the morning, these slipped away too. When morning came, Cornwallis went to catch his fox, but the fox was not there. He looked for the Americans. There was the place where they had been digging. Their campfires were still burning. But where had they gone? Cornwallis thought that Washington had crossed the river by some means, but soon he heard guns firing away back toward Princeton. He thought that it must be thunder, but he found that it was a battle. Then he knew that Washington had gone to Princeton. Washington had marched all night. When he got to Princeton, he met the British coming out to go to Trenton. They were going to help Cornwallis to catch Washington. But Washington had come to Princeton to catch them. He had a hard fight with the British at Princeton, but at last he had beat them. When Cornwallis knew that Washington had gone to Princeton, he hurried there to help his men, but it was too late. Washington had beaten the British at Princeton and had gone on into the hills where he was safe. The fox had got out of the trap. Thanks so much for listening. Please like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Love to hear from you guys. I love you. As Tigger says, ta-ta for now.